Hello everyone, I am Bhavna and Dhvani and Hina. We are going to discuss an article, Introduction History in Translations. This is abstract an article. The article examines the positive or utopian response to the post-colonial condition developed by Tejaswini Niranjana in sitting translation. Her attempt to harness translation in the service of decolonization. It traces a post-colonial myth moving from pre-coloniality through the recent colonial past and current post-coloniality to an imagined future state of decolonizations in order to contrast nationalist versions of that myth with their emphasis on the purity of the pre-colonial and decolonized states to post-colonialist versions which insist that all four states are mixed. Niranjana draws on Walter Benjamin's the task of the translator in order to explore the ways of in which translating, like rereading, rewriting history, involves citing or quoting of words from one context to another, allowing translations to be used by colonists for purposes of colonial subjugations, but also by post-colonial subjects for purposes of decolonizations. Finally, the article contrasts Niranjana's Benjaminian sense of literalism as the best decolonizing translational mode with the variety of approaches explored by Vicente Rafael in contracting colonialism. This is key points of an article. So first, situating translation as the interpolation and the question of history. Now, situating translations. In a post-colonial context, the problematic of translation becomes a signification site for raising questions of representations, power, and historicity. The context is one of the contesting and contested stories attempting to recount the asymmetry and inequality of relations between people, races, and languages, and also through the discourses of philosophy, history, and anthropology, philology, linguistic, and literary interpretations. The colonial subject constructed through technologies or a practice of power knowledge is brought into being within multiple discourse and on multiple sites. In one such a site is translations. Translation as a practice of shapes and text shaped within the asymmetrical relations of power that operate under colonialism. And the translation depends the Western philosophical notions of reality, representation, and acknowledge. Reality is seen as something unproblematic out there knowledge. Uh, Involves representation of this reality, and representation provides a direct immediate access to transparent reality. So and she contend that simultaneously translation in the colonial context produces and support conceptual economic that works into the discourses of Western philosophy of function as a philosophy. And Jacques Derrida suggests, the concept of metaphysics are not bound by or produced solely within the field of philosophy. Rather, they come out of the circulate through various discourses in several registers, providing a conceptual network in which philosophy itself has been constituted. And also translation brings into being overarching concept of reality and presentations. The translation reinforce hegemonic versions of the colonized, helping them acquire the status of what Edward Said calls representations or object without history. Thomas Babington Macaulay's 1835 dismissal of indigenous Indian learning as outdated and irrelevant, which prepared the way of the introduction of English education. And translation functions as a transparent presentation of something that already exists, although the original is actually brought into being through translation. Paradoxically, translation also provides a place in history for colonized. The Hegelian conception of history that translation helps bring into being endorses teleological hierarchical model of civilizations based on the coming to consciousness of spirit, an event for which the non-Western cultures are unsuited or unprepared. And Tejaswini's concerns here is to explore the place of translation in contemporary Euro-American literary theory through a set of interrelated readings. In the chapter 1, she shows how they bring into being hegemonic versions of the non-Western other. She will therefore discuss the pertinence of the critique of historicism to a world undergoing decolonizations. Given the enduring nature of Hegelian presentations of the non-West and the model of teleological history that authorized them, a question of the model could underwrite a new practice of translations. In the chapter 2, she examined how translation works in the traditional discourses of translation studies and in ethnographic writings, and also on idiom of fidelity and betrayal that assumes an unproblematic notion of representations. Translation studies fail to ask questions about the historicity of translations. Ethnography, on the other hand, has recently begun to question both the innocence of representation and the long-standing asymmetries of translation. In chapter 3, 4, and 5, she's main focus is the work of Paul Deman, Jacques Derrida, and Walter Benjamin. All three thinkers becoming associated with major preoccupations in its allegory of or literature. In Deman, the problematic of representation and intentionally Derrida, and the question of materialist historiography in Benjamin. And the refusal of the major proponents of deconstruction to address the question of history in Benjamin suggests a critical drawback in their theory, and perhaps indicates why deconstruction has never addressed the problem of colonialism. In the final chapter, with the help of the translation from Canada, a South Indian language, in English, she discusses the uses of post-structuralism in post-colonial space. In this work belongs to the larger context of the crisis in English, that is a consequence of the impact of structuralism and post-structuralism on literary studies in a rapidly decolonizing world. And this discipline replaces what Derrida, in the word of Heidegger, calls the logocentric or onto theological metaphysics, by which they are constituted, which involves all the traditional conceptions of representation, translation, reality, unity, and acknowledgement. And the rethinking of translation becomes an important task in a context where it has been used since the European Enlightenment to underwrite practices of subjectification, especially for colonized peoples. Such a rethinking a task of great urgency for post-colonial theory, attempting to make a sense of subject already living in translation, imagined and reimagined by colonial ways of seeing. And also the term decolonization can refer only crudely to what has in the language of national liberation, liberation or struggles been called the transfer of power, usually from the reigning colonial power to indigenous elite. And the important of the transfer, it would be naive to believe it marks the end of domination, for the strength of colonial discourse lies in its enormous flexibility, and the discourse is used here in the sense not incompatible with Michel Foucault's notion. As the rest of this chapter will show, however, his use of the term is not exclusively dependent on the Foucauldian framework. Colonial relations of power have often been reproduced in conditions that can only be called neo-colonial and ex-colonial. Something sometimes hunger for the English book as avidly as their ancestors. The post-colonial is therefore still scored through by an absentee colonialism. And also, she used the word translation not just to indicate an interlingual process, but the name on entire problematic. It is a set of questions, perhaps a field charged with the force of all the terms used, even by the traditional discourse on the translations, to name the problem or to translate translations. Translatio is Latin word and metaphorin is Greek word. At once suggest a moment disruption, displacement. And the thrust of displacement is seen also in other Latin terms such as a transfer, transponer, transfer, rhetor, water. In she's writing, translation refer to the problematic of translation that authorized and is authorized by certain classical notions of representation and reality, and the problematic open of the post-structuralist critique of the earliest one, and that makes translation always the more or the supplement in Derrida's concept. His study of translation does not make any claims to solve the dilemmas of translations, and it does not propose at another way of theorizing translation to enable a more foolproof method of narrowing the gap between cultures. It seeks rather to think through this gap, this difference, to explore the positioning of the obsession and desire of translation, and thus to describe the economies within which the sign of translation circulates. His concern is to probe the absent lack or repression of the awareness of symmetry and historicity in several kind of the writing on translations, since it has in any case been extensively dealt with by mainstream literary critics. In the post-colonial distrust of the liberal humanist rhetoric of progress and of universalizing master's narrative have obvious affinities with post-structuralism, and Derrida would argue that the origin is itself its identity undecidable. A representation thus does not represent an original, rather it represents that which is always already represent. And another aspect of post-structuralism that is significant for a rethinking of translation is its critique of historicism, which shows the genetic and teleological nature of traditional historiography. So this is my part, and further information I would like Dhvani.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I will continue from the second part, and the title is Translation as Interpolation. So first, let's understand what is interpolation, an occasion when questions are formally asked of a government minister in parliament. And in this second part, Tejaswini Niranjana has discussed many scholars' notes. The first is McConaughey, then William Jones, then William Ward, James Mill, Macaulay, Charles Trevelyan, Gauri Vishwanathan, and many other research scholars are also there. So, first, McConaughey, a scholar connected to Edinburgh University, urged to the sovereign to take steps as many be necessary for discovering, collecting, and translating whatever is extant of the ancient works of the Hindus. William Jones, who is British philosopher and judge of the Supreme Court of West Bengal and also the scholar of ancient India, he notes that who arrived in India in 1783 to take his place on the bench of the Supreme Court in Calcutta, that translation would serve to the domestic the Orient and thereby turn it into a province of European world. As translator and scholar, Jones was responsible for the most influential introduction of textualized India to Europe. Within 3 months of his arrival, the Asiatic Society held its first meeting with William Jones as a president and Warren Hastings, the Governor General, as patron. In his letter, he declared that Persian translation and grammar of Persian had already made him the famous and Orientalist before he came to India. He declares that his ambition was to know India better than any other European ever knew it. His works were carefully studied by the many writers of that age, especially the Germans, Goethe, Herder, and others. Uh, then, as a 20th century scholar puts it, it is not an exaggeration to say that he altered Europe's whole conception of the Eastern world. If we were compiling a thesis on the influence of Jonas, we could collect most of our material from footnotes ranging from Gibbon to Tennyson. In the preface of the 1984 Indian edition of John's Discourses and Essays, where the editor Moni Bakchi indicates that the Indians should try to preserve accurately and interpret the national heritage by treading the path chalked by Sir William Jones. Just yeah. So So here Tejaswini Niranjana's main concern is the examining the text of Jonas is not necessary to compare his translation of Shakuntala or Manu's Dharmashastra with the so-called originals. Rather, what she proposed to do is to examine the outwork of Jonas' translation, the prefaces, the annual discourses to the Asiatic Society, his charges of grand jury at Calcutta, his letters, and his Oriental poems to show how he contributes to his theoretic teleological model of civilization that coupled with the notion of translation presupposing transparency of representation. Now, the most significant notes of John's work are the first one is the need of translation by the Europeans, since the natives are unreliable interpreters of their own laws and culture, the desire to be a lawgiver, to give the Indians their own laws, and the third one is the desire to purify Indian culture and speak on its behalf. The interconnections between these obsessions are extremely complicated. In John's construction of the Hindus, they appear as submissive, indolent nation unable to appreciate the fruits of freedom, desirous of being ruled by an absolute power, and sunk deeply in the mythology of an ancient religion. In a letter, he also points out that the Hindus are incapable of civil liberty, for few of them have an idea of it, and those who have do not wish for it. The idea of submissive Indians, their inability to be free, and the native laws that do not permit the question of liberty to be raised are thus brought together in the concept of Asian despotism. So the glorious past of India, according to Jonas, is shrouded in superstitions, marked and bedecked in the fantastic robes of mythology and metaphor. But now, degenerate and abysed Hindus were once eminent in various knowledge. This notion of an Indian golden age seems to contradict John's insistence on the unchanging nature of Hindu society. By Indian, he says that by Indian, I mean that the whole extent of the country in which the primitive religion and languages of the Hindus prevail at this day with more or less their ancient purity. So now as a Supreme Court judge in India, Jonas took on as one of his most important projects the task of translating the ancient text of Hindu law, Manu's Dharma Shastra. In a letter, Jonas wrote that the difficulty of checking and controlling native interpreters of several codes, saying that pure integrity is hardly to be found among the Pandits. Here the Pandit means the Hindu learned man, and the Maulvis, that means the Muslim learned man, few of whom give opinion without a culpable bias. Before embarking on his study of Sanskrit, Jonas wrote to Charles Wilkins that who had already translated a third of Dharma Shastra, it is one of the utmost importance that the stream of Hindu law should be pure, for we are entirely devotion of the native lawyers through our ignorance of Sanskrit. Even before coming to India, Jonas had formulated a solution for the problem of translating Indian law. Writing to Lord Convince in 1788, he mentions once again the deceiving native lawyers and unreliability of their opinions. Jones, like his patron Warren Hastings, was a staunch advocate of the idea that Indians should be ruled by their own laws. However, since the deluded and besotted Indians thought of liberty as a curse rather than a blessing, William John's desire was to purify Hindu law, art, and philosophy. Is another version of British discourse of improvement. So, for example, in some poems like A Hymn to Ganga, Jonas shifts the first person pronoun away from himself to create a subject position for the colonized, making the Hindu speak in favor of the British, who preserve our laws and bid our terror cease. So two main kind of translators of Indian literature existed in late 19th century, late 18th and early 19th centuries. Administrators like William Jones, Christian missionaries like the Serampore Baptist William Carey and William Ward. Now the another researcher is William Ward, who is English pioneer and author, printer and translator. In his preface to his 3-volume, A View of the History, Literature and Mythology of the Hindus, is instructive for the virulence with which it attacks and depravity and immorality of the natives. The Indian people, both Hindu and Muslim, were as John Mills, the another critic, characterized this Hindu and Muslims that they are mendacity, perfidy and venality. The Hindu, like the Anuj, he said that excels in the qualities of a slave. Mill declares that, John Mill, on the page 22, the second paragraph, Mill declares that to ascertain the true state of Hindus in the scale of civilization is of the greatest practical importance for the British. And also, Mill trashes the Puranas as false history, but is willing to accept evidence from the play Shakuntala regarding the political arrangement and laws of the age. And for years a controversy raged between Orientalist and Anglicist. Now what is Orientalist? Orientalist meaning the person who studies the Asian countries and the languages. So they have the controversy to whether the money set aside for education by the Act of 1830 was to be used for the indigenous education or Western education. Macaulay, who think that it is necessary for the Indian populace to learn English, he did not think that it is necessary for the Indian populace to learn English. The function of Anglicized education was to form a class who may be interprets between us and the millions whom we govern, a class person, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Macaulay's brother-in-law Charles Trevelyan wrote about how the influence of indigenous elite would secure the permanence of the change wrought by Western education. So the Gauri Vishwanathan also pointed out that the introduction of English education can be seen as the embodied response to historical and political pressures, to tensions between the English Parliament and the East India Company, between the Parliament and the missionaries, between the East India Company and the native elite classes. So the desire of colonial discourse to translate in order to control control in order to translate in symbolical domination is a crucial, and physical domination is evidenced in colonial missionaries' efforts to compile grammars of unknown languages. And on the last page, the drive to study, to codify, and to know the Orient employs the classical notions of representation and reality criticized by pro-structuralists like Derrida and Diemen. Their work offers a related critique of traditional historicism that is of great relevance in post-colonial context. For the third point, I would like to call Hinaba.
Hello, I am discuss the third point of the question of history. Samuel Weber charges Johnson with using the gesture of capitalizing history to address the challenge of post-structuralist thoughts. Weber is one of the latest salvos in the prologue scheming between the defenders of post-structuralism and those who are accused it of denying history. As the post-structuralists perceived it, the demand that the address history comes increasingly from the left, especially from those who have taken on deconstruction in more sense than one. If the former polemizes against the history is a phallogocentrism, the latter argue that is an untranscendable horizon. Neither specified whether the history in the questions refer to the mode of writing history or to the past itself. Niranjana's concern here to elaborate on the battles for history now being a stage in Euro-American theory, but to ask a series of questions from a strategically partial perspective, that of an emerged post-colonial practice willing to profit from the insights of post-structuralism, while at the same time demanding ways of writing history in order to make a sense of how subjectification operates. Her purpose that to take a historicity to mean although not unproblematical effective history, or that part of the past that is still operate in the present. She used the word historicity to avoid invoking history with capital H. She concerned being with her local practices of translation that required no overarching theory of to contend them. Indicate earlier that post-colonials have good reason to be suspicious of theological historicism, which Derrida has rightly characterized as a manifestation of Western metaphysics. But since the facts of history are inescapable for post-colonial, since attention to history is in a sense demanded by the post-colonial situation, post-colonial theory has to formulate a narrativizing strategy in addition to reconstruction. The use of historicity or effective history may help us sidestep the metaphysics of linearity. The Louis Althusser's critique of historicism, which leads him, in Jameson's words, to formulate the notion that history is the process without telos or the subject. Repudiations of master narratives and their twin category of narrative closure and character. The notions that history can be apprehended only through its effect is directly relevant to the theorists seeking, like Foucault, genealogists, to understand the play of dominations and system of subjection. Walter Benjamin, who sees the historians sizing the past image that comes into a constellations with the past. This community of the past we construct may provoke us to discuss the various translations and how it shows that we need to translate history rather than to interpret it or read it. In the series of details, a reading of Heidegger, Sasso, Levi-Strauss, and Rousseau, Derrida demonstrate how representations and writing already belong to sign and the significance. In this play of representations, the point of origin becomes ungraspable. There is no longer simple origin. It is interesting to speculate what impact these notions of origins might have on deep-rooted European histories of the of civilizations and on post-colonial people's image of themselves. Yes, the Derrida points to historicism's concern with origins and telos and its desire to construct a totalizing narrative. History in the text of culturalism. History in the text of post-structuralism is the repressive force that obligates different and belongs in the chain that includes some meaning, truth, presence, and logos. Derrida's critiques of representation is important for post-colonial theory because it suggests a critique of traditional notions of translation as well. In fact, the two problematics have always been intertwined in Derrida's work. He has indicated more than once that translations perhaps escapes the orbits of representations and is therefore an exemplary questions. If representation stands for the reappropriate for process, translation emerges as the sign for what Derrida would call disseminations. We must, however, carefully interrogate the conversation's concept of translation that belong to the order of representation, adequacy, and truth. The point, the denial of historicity to conquered peoples and that suppress history in order to appear as a history. It is aware that the situations of the post-colonial subject who lives already in translations required for its articulation some notions of what history is. The point is not just to criticize this characterization as inadequate or untruth. One should attempt to show the complicity of representations with colonial rules and their part in the maintaining the asymmetry of imperialism. In the essay of subaltern study, historians Gayatri Spivak argue argues that their practice is akin to deconstructions, since they put forward a theory of charge as the site of displacement of functions between sign systems. And this is the theory of reading in the strongest possible general sense. Since in the part of Tejaswini argue that the problematics of translations and the writing of history are inextricably bound together. She briefly go over Spivak's main points regarding the subaltern historians. May help us see more clearly how the nations of history and translations she wished to reinscribe are not only enabled by the post-colonial critics of historiography, but might also further strengthen that critique. History and translations functions perhaps under the same order of representations, truth, and presence, creating coherent and transparent text through the repressions of different and participating thereby in the process of colonial domination. The double inscriptions Derrida mentioned has a parallel in Walter Benjamin's strategy of citation and quotations. For Benjamin, the historical materialist quotes without quotation marks in the method akin to montage. It is the only way of revealing the constellations past age from with the present without submitting to a simple historical continue to an order of origin and telos. And when we begin to understand how colonial power end up producing hybridizations, the discursive conditions of domains can be turned into the grounds of interventions. The hybrid, therefore, involves translation, deformation, and displacement. As Baba is carefully to point out, colonial hybridity is not a problem of cultural identity that can be resolved by a relativist approach. It is rather a problematic of colonial representations and individuations that reverses the effect of colonialist disavowal, so that other deny knowledge it enter upon the domination discourse and extend the basic of its authority. The notions of hybridity, which is of the great importance for the subaltern critique of historiography as well as for a critique of a traditional notions of translation, is both ambitious and historical complex. In the rastric hybridity, Tejaswini called it living in translation to a post-colonial elite is to deny the pervasiveness, however heterogeneous, of the transformations wrought across class boundaries by colonial and neo-colonial dominations. Hybridity can be seen, therefore, as a sign of post-colonial theory that subverts essentialist models of reading while it points towards a new practice of translation. Thank you.